Welcome to this discussion with Safari Energy. I'm Darius Rezgaitis, Director of Marketing and Communications here at Safari. We're here today to discuss buildings that are solar ready. This is the idea that when you're building a new building, there are a few things to keep in mind to make sure that it will support solar panels and other solar equipment once the building is completed. This topic is getting a lot of attention lately, especially when several states like California, New Jersey, and Maryland are considering or have already passed legislation that requires new commercial structures to be built solar ready. And there is, in fact, a lot of new construction happening right now, particularly in the industrial space. Here to talk about it today are Ron Wedeking, at Safari Energy's SVP of Business Development, and Dan Jordan, our SVP of Operations. We'll start with you, Dan. What exactly does solar ready mean?
Thanks, Doris. So that's a pretty broad question. Usually people think about it in technical terms only, but I'll start by saying that solar is driven by also programs where the facility might be located. So you may want to think about the program that you may participate in, whether it's a behind the meter or a community solar program. But specifically for this conversation, let's talk about the physical characteristics of the property of the building. Of course, we think rooftop initially, because rooftop solar projects are typically cheaper to build. They're easier to permit. Keep in mind that you can also design and build a facility that can accommodate a parking lot canopy system or a parking garage carport, or even a ground mount, depending on, say, if you have a multi-story building. But again, speaking of a rooftop solar facility, there's some basics. Okay, so you want your roof structure to be capable of supporting the extra allowable load of a solar facility. You want to keep the space clear and contiguous as much as possible, the same level. You want to think about your electrical infrastructure and how you're going to get the the DC electricity or AC electricity down to or into the electrical room, space for electrical tie-in. Basic things like that need to be considered.
That's great. Now, Ron, believe it or not everyone who's building a new building is thinking about putting solar on the roof. So what do you say to those who should be thinking about it, particularly with what I mentioned at the top, that legislation that's coming down that's causing companies to pay attention to being solar ready?
Yeah, thanks, Darius. And it's not just legislation that's coming down. There's something called ESG that's putting tremendous pressure on the real estate market and building owners to bring their buildings up to higher standards of energy efficiency. So ESG stands for environmental, societal, and governmental policies. And we're being hit on a weekly basis with inquiries about how we can help companies address their ESG concerns. And everybody from CEOs, CFOs, sustainability officers are very concerned about their company's reaction and action, more importantly. And they're getting pressure from stakeholders and stockholders and customers alike to pay attention to ESG as it relates to their business. So yeah, it is a very strong topic of conversation that we continue to engage and provide solutions for.
Great, thanks. And so if these companies do decide to go solar or be solar ready, they want to make sure that their projects are as uncomplicated as possible. But Dan, I'm sure over the years, you've probably seen some solar unready buildings. Can you share with us maybe a couple of examples that could have been avoided to make a better project?
Sure. So, and of course, there are some. Solar unready can mean a lot of things, like a very tall building with a lot of clutter on the rooftop, shading. There's just not much space to do anything, and if you had even the space, it would be very expensive to build anything. But the projects that disappoint me the most, I'll say, are the buildings or where you have a big, clear, open rooftop, and you do the structural analysis on it, and you find out that you have virtually no allowable load for anything on that roof, because you have to account for things like snow load and maybe the type of roofing that's on that roof. That's frustrating, because now you have what could be very viable real estate for a solar project, but you're limited by a decision that was made in the design of the building, maybe for cost, but for whatever reason. Sometimes just to keep in mind that decision might have been made when the codes were less stringent, and then the code gets changed because of, number of things like the weather, right? And now the building owner is faced with a constraint that you can't build on it. In other situations I've seen, again, really nice roofs, and there was a decision to hang a lot of piping or HVAC or chiller equipment from the roof that takes away from what the roof can support. I mean, you have a facility, think about it, that has a lot of consumption because you might have a lot of, like a refrigerated warehouse, for example, but because the structural capacity was taken away and used for something else, then you couldn't put solar on it. The type of roof, there's a lot of things. Landscaping, maybe trees that were put on the south side of the building that maybe could have been located in other areas because they cause shading. Sometimes roofs are made with a built-up product that has rock on it that is used to ballast the roof. That's a difficult product to work with in installing solar. You either have to remove it and put on a new roof with a membrane, or I've seen it built on top of a ballasted system, but that's very complicated and expensive. So I guess where I'll end on this with rooftops is, the type of equipment, if there's multiple layers or gas piping and RTUs, things like that on the roof, then that skylights, for example, and this is something to think about. Every one of these objects that are on the roof, you have to set back from with your solar array. You can't build a solar array right up to it. You have to provide access, and sometimes there's a fall hazard. So a skylight, for example, you have to set back far enough from a skylight so that there's not a fall hazard. Fire codes require roof access around the roof, so the clutter is a problem. So things like that you have to think about.
Yeah, so thanks, Dan. I think you mentioned quite a few types of buildings, perhaps like cold storage or an industrial building. Tall buildings like office skyrises might not be as suitable to be solar ready. But I guess this question would be for Ron then. Who should be thinking about solar ready buildings? Is it the building owner, or if you're building a new building to be solar ready, probably the developers, right? The real estate developers.
Yeah, actually, it's a broad spectrum of people that really are paying attention to ESG requirements as it relates to their buildings, and when they are building new buildings, are giving a lot of thought to it. Certainly real estate developers, but also asset owners. So large real estate investment trusts that own, in some cases, thousands of buildings across the country in industrial, retail, office, healthcare, as well as even some municipal buildings. So there's a large variety of people that have an interest in building a building that is solar ready. And a lot of it has to do, and Dan can get into the details of this, but has to do with the retrofit that takes place. And we've seen it on brand new buildings that no thought was given to any kind of renewable energy, either on the roof or on the ground. And the problem is that we've seen electrical rooms that don't have enough space in them to accommodate the switchgear for solar. We have roofs that have penetrations now through them to get to electrical rooms that would have been unnecessary if they would have put the conduit in ahead of time and planned for it. It's not that expensive to do it in the building process. It gets expensive to run conduit and create extra space in tight rooms.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll take that transition to Dan for sure. Like, what stage do you start thinking about solar? Probably we would prefer that it would be at the earliest stages of conception of a real estate development, but where is it still feasible to implement features that make sense for solar?
Right. So clearly, the earlier the better, right? I mean, if you're planning a facility, the purpose of the facility is paramount, right? However, as Ron was mentioning, because this is coming or there's money to be made, right, that the earlier you think about it, the better. So if you brought in a solar consultant early in this process, say you want to get LEED certified, for example, that's very helpful. Okay, some minor thinking around, again, where you're placing equipment, the type of roof, the type of structure, the electrical room, the landscaping, simple things like that can be figured out without a major change to the purpose of the building and pay big dividends down the line. So now I'm not dealing with a structural constraint or having to move anything around or constraining my solar array. As you move through the process, it just gets harder, right? So it's really easy to have this conversation early in the design process to make the facility ready as possible.
Yeah, and I think, Ron, probably a lot of our clients and prospects would like to hear that we're saving them money by doing these sorts of things up in advance. I'm sure there's some cost involved sometimes for the type of roofing material maybe that should be required if you're building for solar from the start, but maybe you can talk about some of the costs and the benefits associated with being solar ready.
Yeah, certainly roofing is one of the areas that you can have the most impact by making those decisions early. And choosing a white reflective roof that can also bounce solar back up into the bottom side of the panel, it's called a bifacial panel, can be a big solution and gain you extra production. And just by picking the right roof out and picking the right thickness of the roof with a minimum of a 60 mil or even a 90 mil roof that is going to last 25 to 35 years. So you're not replacing the roof underneath the system. That gets to be very expensive and it is a real tragedy when people put new systems on old rooftops. So we certainly want to avoid the age of the roof not lasting for the age of the solar, which in many cases can be 25 to 35 years.
And I guess there's probably benefits as well, not just the tangible ones like a system that lasts longer, costs less to install, but like you were mentioning earlier, ESG pressure is a big factor as well, right?
Yeah, it really is. And by putting some thought process into making your building solar ready and storage ready, you're planning a building that is going to be more appealing to tenants that are looking for that type of building now. They really do react positively to developers and real estate groups that put the effort into their buildings to make them as green as possible. It is a new day in real estate, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think, well, you mentioned storage, and I think maybe a lot of our customers and prospects, when they're thinking about solar, only start thinking about storage later on in the process, or even electric vehicle charging stations later on. But maybe these are all things that should be considered at the beginning along with solar. And maybe Dan, can there be buildings that are not only solar ready, but also battery ready and EV charging ready and other sustainability practices that are thought about in the construction phases?
Absolutely. And again, I would try to think about it as early as possible, in the early design phase. I mean, they all have some things that are constant, like code compliance. You just can't put solar anywhere on a roof because of fire codes and setbacks. Similarly for storage, right? There's a lot of fire codes around battery storage. That doesn't mean that it's hard. It just means that you've got to be mindful of where you're building it, what the codes are. Some of them are national, some of them are local, but it's all very doable. And then you want to think about just the electrical systems and what you're going to be accommodating, okay, where you're going to be routing your conduits, where you're going to be placing battery systems or charging systems. It's very popular now to put a canopy system on a parking lot and then put electrical vehicle charging with it. If you could do that during the initial construction phase of the building, that's great. You save a lot of money that way. What can you place outdoors? It's especially when it comes to storage versus being forced to find a space inside a building or on a rooftop, where now the code compliance becomes a lot more difficult. All right, you may have to do some physical retrofits of the building to make it code compliant. So again, if you can set aside space, some of the things that seem obvious in retrospect is where I've seen electrical equipment placed really close to, say, loading docks or stairways and things like that. And if you can just allow some space around that, some space around driveways, then we don't have to worry about taking away parking places or blocking access to loading docks and things like that. Again, it's really beneficial to think this through in the beginning versus after the fact. After the fact, you just have to deal with what you have. But again, there's a multitude of things here on the design side and that have to be taken into consideration.
Great, thanks, Dan. Well, it looks like we're coming up on time, so I'd like to thank you both for this discussion today. It sounds like if architects and engineers and construction companies, EPCs, real estate developers all start thinking about solar early in the process, they can probably save a lot of headaches, but then also benefit their tenants and future customers by pursuing ESG goals and being ready to go solar from the beginning. So if you're one of those types, please visit safarienergy.com and get in touch, and we can help you make sure that the building you're building can accommodate solar much more easily than if you did it after it's done. Thanks again, and we hope to hear from you soon.